So my name is Caroline Howard, and I am a senior editor at Forbes. And my beats revolve around millennials, education, and entrepreneurial women, which means that Shiza is actually the embodiment of all of my beats. So I'm so pleased to be able to talk to you today about your work and where you're going and what you've done. And so for this conversation, I'd like to divide it up into different sections. So let's talk about your background, which I think is so critical to the work that you've done. And then we'll move into your work with Malala. And then I want to get into some serious conversation about women and girls education. And then we'll take some questions from all of you. So Shiza, when we had lunch together about a month ago, you told me, and I had to write this down, I was so impressed with it. You said that you felt from a very young age that your destiny was to change the world, which is a pretty big bite to take out of life. So I want to talk to you about your family, starting with your parents, which were so critical to the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm so excited to be here and really honored to have you interviewing me because I've watched your writing and your work for many years and am a big fan, so I feel very privileged. And thank you to everyone who made it out early. I know I barely made it out of bed myself, so thank you. I guess starting with my background, every time I speak, I always start with a picture of my parents, and I think we just gonna get the PowerPoint set up. Is it?
It's there. We just can't see it.
Oh, really?
It's there.
Ooh. So is this the picture? Ah. Okay. All right.
You'll have to report back to us what's on the screen, okay?
So I was
Shiza.
born. I see it. I see it. I thought that was the next one, though.
Oh, okay.
I was born in Pakistan and to parents of humble origin. So my father was born in a village in Pakistan and lost his own father when he was 9 years old and grew up very poor. And my mother was born in a neighboring city and was the oldest of 4 daughters. And so those of you familiar with the culture that exists on that side of the world, she was told very early that she had to get married in time so that her younger sisters could also find suitable husbands. And my parents met on their wedding day, and my mother looked around and said, "Which one is he?" But luckily they ended up being an incredible pair and always supported and empowered each other. And what they always prioritized was to educate me and my siblings in the best schools in the country. And there was a time when my father would spend half of his income on primary schooling because he refused to send us to government schools. And so I grew up very fortunate in a very loving home with many opportunities, with a good education. But I was also growing up in Pakistan and at a time that was particularly turbulent. So Pakistan is consistently ranked on all indices as one of the worst places to be born a woman. It has the second highest number of children out of school, many problems in governance, security. And I was really growing up in the post 9/11 world when regional security was declining and things like suicide attacks, IEDs, terms I had never heard before, were becoming commonplace.
Shiza, how old were you when 9/11 happened?
I think I was 10 or 11. And in the years following, regional security really started to plummet. And there was, first it was at a distance, and then it became closer, and there was a suicide attack less than a mile from my home, and another one in the hotel where my sister had gotten married. And so feeling of instability and insecurity was very real. But even outside of that, there was a sense that while I lived in privilege outside of the 4 walls of my house, there was a lot that was going wrong. And I wanted to understand what was happening in my society and to help change that.
So when you were about 16 years old, you decided to start your career in baby steps, of course, but you really started your career in grassroots mobilization, campaigning, activism, and advocacy. So, and your first steps I thought were really interesting what you chose to do. So why don't you tell everybody about that?
Yeah, I just began volunteering very young, 13, 14 years old, and I was fortunate that growing up in Pakistan, I was given the opportunity to do what I wanted to do. I could walk into a women's prison and nobody would ask me to sign a legal waiver and disclose my age, and I could just go in and be an actor and have the power to create change. So I started out probably at the age of 13 volunteering with a local NGO, working in women's prisons where there were particularly bad conditions for women. And inside the prisons were not only women, but their children who had been born to them while inside prison, and there was no support structure outside for them. So these children were effectively growing up inside jails. And what I went in to do was to hold medical camps, because there were no female doctors in that particular prison. And I would hold these medical camps with a local NGO. And in those conversations that I would have with these women, I started to understand aspects of my society that I hadn't been exposed to earlier on. What it felt like to have a child who had to live with you inside a prison. Or, for example, when I was 16 years old, there was a massive earthquake in Pakistan, and one of my closest friends died, and he died because he lived in a building with faulty material. And I dealt with that grief by spending the next year, day in and day out, working in an earthquake relief camp. And I was the only regular female volunteer, so once again, issues regarding women and girls, regardless of my age, were brought to me. So I would take women to the hospital in the middle of the night. I still remember this one time where this woman and I went to the hospital, and she had severe chest pain. And we realized once we were at the doctor that her breast milk had frozen inside her. Or I would spend a lot of time with the young girls in the camp. And very often we'd be inside a hot, stuffy tent, and I'd say, let's go outside. And they would say, our fathers or our brothers don't want us roaming outside during the day. And that's where I came to understand what it means to be a woman in a place where your very body, your very existence is a source of shame.
So your own parents, of course, did not have that issue. Why was that? Was it something that you had to convince them of, or was it something that they believed in, that you had your own efficacy and you didn't need that sort of sheltering?
Well, my parents were very progressive, and there are, many people in Pakistan who are very progressive, and even in traditional environments in Pakistan, women have a lot of power in certain ways. And so, I want to be careful to say that things like the veil or the chadars, as it's known, is very often cultural more than it is a sign of religious extremism or conservatism. It's right. Yeah. It's a cultural choice, and it's almost, and my mother now actually does cover her head, and she didn't for a long time, and later in life decided that she wanted to, and my father was actually confused as to why she made that choice, and it was very much hers to make. But I think my mother and my father were well aware of the opportunities that they didn't get to have, and they wanted me to have those. And one thing that's always surprised me was my mother never let me enter the kitchen. And over here, baking with your mother is one of the fun activities that children do, or baking with your father. And for my mother, housework was a memory of everything that she had to do and everything that held her back from school. So she never wanted her daughters to have to do housework. And they just wanted a better life for us. And so we were very fortunate.
I wish my mother was there.
Well, I do wish I could cook better, but what can you do? I blame my mother.
So when it came time for you to explore your higher education opportunities, I know that you did look within Pakistan, but you again made what I think is a very brave decision, which was just to explore what the globe had to offer.
Yeah, I feel like I've been very fortunate many times in my life. It began with the family I was born into. It went on to be just a sense of faith in the fact that I could create change locally. And when I applied to college, I fully expected to go to a local school, but I thought, well, there's one local school that I would like to go to, in case I don't get in, I should apply to a couple of others. And so naively, I looked up the top 10 schools in the US. I was like, I'll apply to Harvard and Stanford as a backup in case I don't get into this local school.
Stanford as your backup.
Right. And I said, I need a full scholarship. There's no way I can pay for this. And so it was, very much just something that I did. And I was very fortunate in that I did get offers for full scholarships. And I ended up going to Stanford. And that was very exciting for me because I got to study under incredible professors, got to live in Washington, D.C. and Oxford doing various study abroad programs. And I got to start to find my people, social entrepreneurs who wanted to create change in the world.
Was it a difficult transition for you to go from Pakistan not only to the United States and to Stanford, but to come from the circumstances where you were, which was, again, you say, bombs exploded less than a mile from your home, to come to this place where perhaps many of the fellow students came from a more sheltered, privileged background?
Yeah, I think the culture shock of Pakistan to America was a lot less. I'd grown up watching American TV, but the culture shock of, I got a scholarship and here I am to change my destiny. I was a very serious child, and so coming to Stanford, American colleges tend to be very carefree, and I think a lot of children, as they enter university, the first thought on their mind is, finally I'm out of my house and I have to get very good at beer pong. And I was like, all right, guys, here I am. How are we doing this? How are we creating a revolution globally? And so I was a bit of a strange undergraduate. I got told that when I'm asked how I'm doing, I'm supposed to not actually answer that and just say great. So those are things that I picked up over time. But it also opened, and so it was a lonely experience, but it also opened so many doors and made me feel like I had more to offer to those who didn't have this opportunity back home.
So it seems to me like what your guiding light in many ways is you want to create impact. You want to create change. And so can you tell us a little bit about how you came across a young woman named Malala?
Sure. So, life is very serendipitous. At Stanford, I stayed very involved in trying to create impact back home, and I would watch the news constantly. I would hold conference calls with my friends who cared about similar things, and we would strategize. And this was a time of growing fear for me. I was away from home. The proximity of the violence was increasing in my hometown, Islamabad. And so I would go to bed at night with my phone on full volume because I expected a call that would say, someone in your family's been hurt. And luckily that day never came. But that was the environment that I was experiencing at Stanford. And one day I was in my sophomore year when I saw a video, and I was really struck by the video. It was about a town called the Swat Valley, and the Swat Valley is about 3 hours north of my own hometown, the capital of Pakistan, Islamabad, and it's a lot more remote. And it had been the region, that part of the country, but particularly the Swat Valley, had been facing an insurgency by a group we can call the Taliban, even though it was more of an affiliate. And that group had taken over, established control, gotten most of the government to flee, and was blowing up schools, particularly girls' schools. And it had declared that on January 15th, 2009, girls' education would be banned in the Swat Valley. And so I remember watching this video and thinking, my God, this is happening 3 hours from where I grew up, and this could have been me. And the other thing about that time was journalists were also very fearful, so very few people were writing about this. And I heard about this insurgency through the voice of the people featured in this video, which were Malala and her father. And her father owned and ran a girls' school and was struggling to keep it open. And I thought back to my college essays where I had said, if I can just get this education, I'm gonna pay it forward. And it felt like I had to do something, and I didn't know what. This was a governance issue. This was a a political issue, it was a security issue, and I thought, what can I do at 19 from Stanford to actually make a difference? So I called up her father. I got Malala's father's number at the time, and I said, I want to change what's happening. And he said, well, we want your help. You can't come in. It's too dangerous. Let's think about what we can do. So I thought, let's if I can't go in, let's bring this issue to the Capitol. And that summer I went home and organized a summer camp, and I asked Malala and her father to come to that summer camp and brought another 30 girls to that summer camp. And the goal was twofold. One, empower these girls to be more effective in their advocacy. I thought, what can they do with all of the networks, resources, connections that I have? If I can give this to these girls in the thick of this, how much more effective can they be in their advocacy? But more importantly, tell these stories to people who can change the fate of this town, of this place. Politicians, journalists, leaders, people in the Capitol who need to hear this story. I actually, a couple of months ago, I found an old video from the summer camp. It's about 6 years old, so
yeah, let's see it.
I'll play it, and then it'll give you a slightly better sense of the work. Is there volume?
Moderate forces clashing in the most beautiful part of Pakistan, the Swat Valley. The Taliban had intimidated the population, including young girls, forbidding them from going to school. These 26 girls are living witnesses to the central battle within Islam today. They're in Islamabad, part of a program that takes them out of their homes in the Swat Valley. Helping them, a group of university students of Pakistani background who've returned home from abroad with a simple goal: teach the children the importance of education. Shiza chose to spend her summer here, between the 3rd and 4th years of her studies at Stanford University in California.
Pretending to be younger students so that they could go to school, not wearing their uniforms so that they could go to school, hiding their books under their shawls so that they could go to school. And at that point, I think we were just so angry and upset and emotional that we decided we had to do something.
At times, this group of mentors seems disorganized.
Wait, who was the first one?
Shiza is only 20 years old and has done nothing like this before.
We need support. We need, unfortunately, more organization, more of the bureaucratic nitty-gritty that you don't want to do, but you have to, because we are young, and that does come with the burden of not being as easily trusted and not being seen as capable.
The idea is simple enough: confidence-building measures, critical thinking lessons, all framed in the context of religious values the children have heard before, but this time from a different point of view. It's still dangerous. The girls cannot talk about Taliban harassment, because while the government is confident the Taliban was flushed out of the region, the ideology of Sharia law may still linger, and these girls will have to return to their homes in the Swat Valley. So, we talk about childhood dreams.
So I want to become a president and to rule this country in a good way.
So you want to become president to prove to people that a woman can become president in Pakistan?
Yeah.
And you've decided this. How old again are you?
12.
I don't think I believe you.
Okay, I'm just
I think maybe you're
35.
like 30.
They're young, idealistic, but have seen enough to make them grow up quickly. Cal Perry, CNN, Islamabad.
So I love to show this video, even though it's embarrassing because they call us disorganized, which we probably were, it's not the worst thing to be called. But I show this for two reasons. One, because the little girl who says she wants to be president is little Malala, and she's just 12 years old. And I think that's quite sweet. The other, because as he follows these girls around, he says, we can't talk about the Taliban, and that's because my condition for letting him film this video was you cannot ask these girls about the Taliban on TV, because if they say anything, they will be targeted, and that cannot be the result of my work. And so, 5 years later, that did happen, and Malala, of course, had continued to speak out in much more vocal ways than this, which is why she was targeted. But it's chilling to look back at it and see that.
She can't help herself. And
She
she's so
can't.
precocious even at age 12.
She is.
Yeah, she stands out. So, so after your summer camp experience, you went back to Stanford you graduated and you embarked on a career with McKinsey, and that took you to a number of different countries and worked in a number of different countries. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, as I graduated, I had at that point gone home 4 times a year and done things in the impact space a lot like the summer camp. And I was ready to really understand how to go from being a grassroots entrepreneur, which is what I'd been growing up, to an entrepreneur who did things at scale, who created sustainable social businesses and impact that could scale and affect not 30 girls in Swat Valley, but 3 million girls in Pakistan or globally. And so I decided
Which I just want to interrupt is the hallmark of a true social entrepreneur, which is this ability and desire to scale their work, And so I really think it's so admirable that at such a young age you were like, I need to scale my work. I don't want to just help 30 kids. I want to help 3 million kids.
Yeah, and I have tremendous respect for grassroots entrepreneurs because they interact with the work that they do every day, and they touch and feel impact. And sometimes scale, we get lost in scale and measurement, and you realize none of it's actually working. But I do think we're at a point today where we have tools and knowledge and understanding that can allow us to solve a lot of issues at scale. But as I graduated, that was an understanding I wanted to have, and I joined business consulting at McKinsey, and I moved to the Middle East deliberately to try and understand the region. Worked across Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Egypt, and learned tremendously that year. But it was cut short because about a year into that career, Malala was shot.
Wow. Okay. So let's take a breath here. And let's talk about exactly what you went through when you heard that. Did you pick up the phone? Did somebody tell you in person? What feelings went through your head?
Well, I had just landed in Egypt. I was there for a project with McKinsey, and I was in the plane and I turned on my phone, and I had gotten a message from a friend, and it just said Malala's been shot. And it was just a terrible feel. I remember calling up my mother and I said, Malala's been shot. And she said, what? I said, Malala's been shot. She said, what do you mean? I'll call up her father. And I said, no, don't call up her father. Call up someone else. Find out if this is true. You can't call him up right now because I couldn't bring myself to think of what would be going on with him. And so my mother did and verified what had happened. And I kept calling her, and she realized I was very upset. So she, being incredible, got into her car and drove 2 hours north to the hospital where Malala was being treated, and just showed up. And there was Malala and her father and my mother there with her the first couple of days. And right after that, the hospital got surrounded because the story had hit breaking news, and the Pakistani government was very embarrassed and didn't want anything else happening. So my mother got in before that and was with with her parents for the next couple of days, which was very valuable because I was getting very accurate information on her medical treatment. I ended up knowing her anesthesiologist, and so I could call him up, and I had watched a lot of Grey's Anatomy at that time. So I was like, what is the treatment? What's going on? And then I would write down everything and email it to the McKinsey healthcare practice and say, this is the diagnosis. And the doctors were incredible and they were doing all the right things, but I felt like I was involved.
It was the only way that you could feel like you were doing anything. You must have felt sort of powerless.
Right, absolutely. And the doctors would say the first couple of days, just pray for her to make it through the night. And my mother, who's a very religious woman, would say she is looking very, very, very frail, and her head is so swollen. And then she would say, but she's going to make it. And I would say, what do you mean? She's like, I just know. And I know that was a result of her faith because everything else pointed to a different outcome.
Did your mother report at all about what Malala was? Here's this very lively, precocious young woman. What did her spirit? Was it impacted, or?
She was unconscious.
She was unconscious
at that time.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So she was then brought into the UK, and so when is the first time that you got to see her?
Well, she was airlifted to Birmingham, and my mother said goodbye to her family, and we all thought they had gone with her. And it's a long story, but her family wasn't allowed to leave and was taken to a safe house. And so there was about a period for about a week where there was no contact, and eventually a week later her father called up my mother and said, "We're still here, can you come?" And my mother went. We realized there had been all of this political drama and managed to get them on a plane to Birmingham, and they called me up and said, "Can you fly in?" So I flew in the same day that her parents did. Unfortunately, due to everything that had happened, she'd already been awake for a while and alone in the UK, which is terrible, but she had great doctors there by her side. And so the first time that I got to see her was, a few hours after her parents had met her, and it had been about 2 or 3 weeks since the incident.
What was the first thing she said to you?
I don't remember. I mean, she was very tired and very weak the first couple of days. She was very sleepy all the time. And I was really there to support her family and to help them, get through this time. And this was the first time that her family had left the country.
So then you became a really important person to them because, in fact, you became a bridge because the whole world wanted to know, and in fact, the media have a piece of Malala, right? And so, and translate the story in any which terms that they were felt that suited their purposes. And so you actually became the Western wrangler for Malala, which is a huge responsibility again at a very young age. So
I was definitely the Western wrangler. I like that term.
I'm going to give you a little necklace that says Western.
Yeah, I mean, so Malala's story had hit breaking news, and there's always positives and negatives to being famous. And people around the world were really praying for her, and I love this photo of girls in Pakistan because I think since then the narrative has gotten so politicized that this is a really lovely picture that just shows young girls from her own country praying for her. And on the other side of it there was Heidi Klum wearing a Malala t-shirt and Madonna doing a striptease with Malala written on her back, but we won't go into that. But so there was really global support, some of it useful, some of it less useful. And she had become an icon, and there was this little girl just trying to recover, and her family just traumatized with what had happened. And so initially I just wanted them to have the space for Malala to heal and to have the resources to do that in their own time. And so started spending time with them. They were getting constant phone calls from journalists and relatives they'd never met or knew existed who were journalists who were like, "Tell us your story," right? Because again, now nobody really here knew who this girl was. There wasn't a lot out there about her, and everybody wanted to understand who she was. So one of the first things I did was said, you get to tell your story in your own time. And so I helped them get a book in place and a co-author so that over the next year, Malala, as she recovered along with her father, could write her story slowly and release it when she was ready and have that be in her voice. And that then translated into a movie that they also wanted to do. So there's been a movie about her recovery and her time after that comes out this year. And it's with an award-winning documentary maker, Davis Guggenheim, who made Inconvenient Truth and Waiting for Superman and other incredibly and powerful documentaries. And through that time, I kept saying, everyone's asking what they can do to help you. And she would say, "I'm okay, tell them to help the other girls." And it was out of that conversation that the idea of a fund or an organization arose.
And so you helped co-found this fund, and you leveraged it from an idea of don't help me, help other girls, into something that became sort of a worldwide movement and eventually resulted in the Nobel Peace Prize for Malala, the youngest person to ever receive that. And so can you walk us through that experience of growing this fund, managing it, because I'm imagining it could become unruly, like you said, with Madonna painting her name on her back. Like, how do you keep, if you'll excuse the expression, the Malala brand as pure as it could be?
Yeah.
And then the resulting Nobel Prize.
Yeah. It was a whirlwind. So the idea arose, there were some incredible people in the US who kept reaching out. One of them is Megan Smith, who's now the CTO of the White House, and they kept saying, let's start something in her name. And so I brought that idea to the family and said, do you want this to happen? And they said, sure. They were very traumatized at the time. They're like, if you want to do this, if you think it's the right thing, then go do it. And I said, there's all of this noise around Malala right now, but in 10 years, what will remain is her impact, and everything else will fade. And she needs a vehicle to create impact, to drive progress, to support other girls. So I said, I don't know what this is going to look like, but I'm going to set it up. And I did. I set up a bank account under a partner organization called Vital Voices, which does great work around women and girls. And I said, all right, Malala, we're driving funding to this. You and your father get to decide where the funding goes. And then, I said, all right, it's time. It's been 3 months. I need to go back to my work. And so I went back to Dubai and spent 3 weeks at McKinsey and was just constantly obsessed with making sure everything was okay with Malala and that the fund was doing good work. And her and her father kept saying, will you please just leave and do this for us for a little bit? And I kept saying, no, I need, I think, I'm in the middle of my career, let me get you someone else. And they kept saying, well, we really want you to do this. So as I went back and realized all I was thinking about was this work, I had made the decision to leave my job and to set up this organization. So I moved to New York, pulled out the Malala Fund from Vital Voices with their support and created a new entity, and spent the next couple of months working with great partners in Malala and her father to figure out what their vision was. What did they want to do with this story, with this voice, with this opportunity that they had? And came down to two levers that they wanted to pull. One was advocacy. So Malala had this unique platform. When she talked, everybody listened. Could we leverage that to get governments to change policy? To get the Nigerian president to pay attention when 300 girls are kidnapped and more in the north of Nigeria, to get governments to commit when they give education aid to holding countries accountable to quality, to get secondary education to be an important part of the next development goals. How do you leverage her voice to create change at a policy level? And that became a bulk of the work. The other part was, Malala was a grassroots entrepreneur, and she couldn't fathom doing the advocacy work without supporting some amount of girls on the ground. And she said, I want to raise funding and grant it out to local organizations that I think are doing inspiring work. And so that became the second lever, and she started making grants in Pakistan, in Nigeria, and in Jordan for Syrian refugees. And that was the next 2 years, and it was very exciting to see how we were able to bring her voice in to raise awareness around, for example, the Nigerian girls issue. And you see here pictures of Malala with parents of the kidnapped girls, and one of the mothers is holding up a picture of her daughter. And as a result of this work, the president met these parents for the first time, and it had already been about 3 months. Now, it's important to separate chatter from impact. The girls are still kidnapped, and this is such a complex issue. So, even with everything we did, our impact was limited, but we were able to bring the issue back into people's minds. Spending a lot of time on the ground with grassroots communities, or going into places like Jordan to talk about the Syrian refugee crisis, and we have the highest number of refugees since World War II, and we're not thinking about how to support them from an education perspective. So that was really the next 2 years, and I'll show one last picture, which is of the Nobel Peace Prize. And the previous year, I guess it's kind of small, but you see here.
Which one is her dad?
So let me see. So the guy with the hand up, sort of laughing. Yeah, on the side, that's her father. And you see in the back, you see Malala, and you see Kailash Satyarthi, her co-winner. And so it's really the two families and teams together. I'm sitting next to her brother and her mother, and there's her younger brother who's quite funny, right below me. But you know, she was a favorite to win the Nobel Prize, not this year, but the previous year. Everybody thought she was going to win it. It was all over the news. And then they gave it to the Syrian Chemical Weapons Association. And this year, I don't think anyone really expected it. And her father got the call, and he called me right after, and it was a whirlwind. But what I loved about what the Nobel Committee said was that, you know, she had been a favorite last year, but they didn't want to give it to her last year because she was still recovering, and her story was still mainly about the attack on her life. But this year, they gave it to her because of everything she'd done and the way she'd leveraged her voice and created impact since the incident. So it was a very powerful moment, and it felt great to know that the work had brought her here.
That's great. I have a video that I'd like to show. Can you ramp up that video? Malala came to Forbes 30 Under 30 Summit this year, and she received an award. It was post her Nobel Prize, so it was obviously paled in comparison, but she said some very clever things I wanted to share with all of you about being a feminist.
One of the points of contention is, of course, the treatment of women in Islam, and particularly by these people misusing Islam, in your words. Do you consider yourself a feminist, Malala?
Well, I fight for women's rights, and I believe that every woman has the right, everyone has equal rights as men have, because why should there be a difference? Because sometimes people think that women's bodies are weaker and they do not have such big muscles as men have, and they cannot run a family, they cannot run an office, and they are not as wise as men are. But we actually don't see the reality, because in reality it is the woman who is controlling the whole house, who is taking care of the children, who is also cooking, never appreciated for that, who is cleaning the house, never appreciated for that. So I think we have the work that woman does, we think, oh, it's her job and that's what she's supposed to do. While if men does a work in the home, we say, oh, men has done a great job. And so I think we have to change this idea that women are not only supposed to work in the house, is not only just cooking and cleaning the house, but she also has the ability to go outside and to do business, to be a doctor, to be a teacher, to be an engineer. She should be allowed to have any job she likes. She should be treated equally as men are. So I think equal treatment is very important, and this is what Islam teaches, because in Islam we have learned that women have equal rights. And the wife of Prophet, peace be upon him, was also a businesswoman, which is a clear message that women are allowed to go and to be what they want.
So it's been 20 years since the Beijing Declaration, and so you were just, what, 10 at the time?
5.
5. Oh, okay. I guess I was 10.
Not letting you make me 5 years older here.
So this is when Hillary said what I think are just the famous words, which she said, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. And it's my belief that women's issues are the spear point of social change. Mm-hmm. And so I want to talk a little bit about girls in education and women in education and women's rights. And so the way I see it, there are dual narratives, and I wanted to get your take on this. Good news is that there are more girls in school than ever before. They're getting more learning qualifications such as degrees. More women in leadership positions, less maternal mortality, more women are speaking up, leaning in, all of those sorts of things. And yet we have this contrasting storyline of, schoolgirls in Nigeria getting kidnapped, schoolgirls in countries as diverse as Haiti, as Nigeria and Pakistan being targeted for trying to access information which is a larger pattern of violence, discrimination, and inequality for women. So, so what's your take on this? Are things getting better, or are things getting worse, or is it not so black and white?
Well, it's never black and white, but I will say overall, things are getting better, right? I think the lifestyle that we enjoy here today would be unrecognizable, for example, to the first women who marched in the first strike that led to International Women's Day in 1908, the Ladies' Garment Workers Union, wouldn't recognize the privileges that we here, especially in the Western world, have today. And things like maternal mortality have improved worldwide, even in places like Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Those are the places where the greatest progress has been made. And you have in a number of Western countries, including the US, more women getting advanced educational degrees than men. Now there is, of course, a glass ceiling here, and the question is, why is that not translating into women leading in executive roles, women leading in government, and women rising above stereotypes like, Barbie can't code. I don't know how many of you saw the book by Mattel recently, where Barbie had to ask her male friends for help writing the computer science software. But those are the issues here. When you talk about places like northern Nigeria, parts of Pakistan, there are parts of the world where women's rights are regressing, and where girls and women and girls' education have become a battlefield and tools of war. And attacking girls' schools is a war tactic, and buying and trading and enslaving and forcefully converting and marrying women who you have enslaved is becoming a tactic of battle that is being defended, that is being openly perpetrated, and that's horrifying. And that is something that you look at the 21st century and you are horrified that that is happening. And over there you see things going backward, absolutely. And I don't even really know where you begin with northern Nigeria, where schools have been shut down. We know of the 300 girls who were kidnapped, but many, many more have been kidnapped. When we visited, we were told that 7 of the parents of the girls had died from either grief or violence. And so we don't even hear the half of it. In Pakistan recently, there was a bombing in a school in Peshawar where I think 138 children were killed, and that's a tactic of war. So we're facing some unspeakable things today, and it's important to march forward for progress here and shatter the glass ceiling, and it's important to remember that there are grander challenges that we have to face as a global community.
So when you say about, well, where do we start, you are actually embarking on something new yourself. Shiza has since left working primarily with the Malala organization, although she stays on as co-founder and global ambassador. But she's embarking on her own project, which, again, at this luncheon, I was so struck by what you said, that you now your goal is to find the other Malalas and to help fund them and then to give voice to them. So you want to share a little bit about what's next for you?
Absolutely. I feel very fortunate to have been given the opportunity to create a very large movement around Malala, and I have no doubt that she is going to continue to write an incredible story moving forward, and I can't wait to support that and see where that goes. But I'm really excited to put my weight behind really impactful, driven, smart social entrepreneurs driving social change, going back to my passion for scalable impact, finding those who are leading change on the front lines, funding them, supporting them through access to mentors, networks, through support in getting publicity. We're very often not hearing the stories of those who keep their heads down and do the best work. We're better at getting to TED those who are storytellers, but we're not great at finding the social entrepreneurs who you have to pull out of the field to really hear about their work because they're so focused. And so Those are the types of solutions that I'm hoping to focus on, particularly in education, particularly solutions that impact the bottom 3 billion and women and girls, and not just solutions that impact women and girls, but that are driven by women and girls. So the goal is to invest in 50% women entrepreneurs, and I'm very hopeful that that's something we'll be able to achieve.
All right. So we have just about 14 minutes left. I'm sure that you all have lots of questions for Shiza. I don't know if you just want to raise your hand or stand up or go to the microphone, whatever it is you guys want to do. Take it. Not a question. Come on, there's one. Hey.
I have a question about the types of organizations you're looking to fund, or the types of programs you found to be really impactful in preparing young girls to be leaders and to make impact as they grow up.
So let me just, so everybody heard, so what kinds of organizations are you looking for, and what kind of impact on women and girls would light your fire?
Yeah. Well, one thing that is important today is secondary schooling. So as a global community, we've made progress in primary education, but you see girls dropping off dramatically around secondary education. This is the time that they hit puberty, so their families think that they're ready for marriage. This is also a very important time to really have an impact in terms of a silver bullet. So if you're able to delay a girl's marriage by 3 to 4 years by keeping her in school, she has kids later, she's less likely to die during childbirth, her children are healthier, her children are more likely to go to school, she's more likely to earn an income, and 90% of every dollar that a woman earns is invested back into her community. That's typically 30 to 40% for men. So investing in secondary schooling is, it's very high impact. However, a high number of countries don't provide free secondary schooling. The cost is very often prohibitive. The cultural norms are also harder to deal with once a girl is older. And then the quality of schooling is a huge issue. So if we're pushing parents to send their daughters to school, are they actually learning anything that will improve their life outcomes and enable them to get jobs? And those are all things that we need to address. In terms of types of organizations that we're looking to fund, one that I'm excited about is Bridge Schools, and this works on primary schooling, but I'm excited by their scale and their focus on quality. So they've scaled to 120,000 students in a very short period of time and are growing rapidly. And there's a lot of talk about technology and how technology impacts education, and I think very often we get distracted by a shiny tablet or an exciting app. And I love their use of technology because technology is interesting as long as it's seen as a tool. So what they do, for example, is they use aerial mapping to figure out which communities are the poorest of the poor. They use tablets, but they give them only to the teachers because the cost of giving it to the students is high. And the teachers are able to use a script off the tablet to actually deliver the lesson. The teachers check in twice a day. Now, they can't keep them synced the whole time because data is expensive, but they sync twice a day to make sure that the teachers are present. And they enter all the scores of their students so that you're able to see which teachers are doing well, which students are doing well, who needs an intervention. And so rather than simply handing a tablet with a lot of games and apps and books on it, they're using it as a tool to empower teachers, which is so important. So that would be, that scale and that focus on quality and innovative new ways of doing things would be the sorts of solutions we would fund. And they've brought their costs down to under $5 a day. So you can really see them serving the poorest of the poor populations.
Oh, can you use the mic? Sorry. There you go. So now we have lots of questions.
Sometimes I come across women who don't feel that girls and women should be empowered because of cultural, religious, or some other reason. From their perspective, they don't think that the fight is worth it. Do you encounter that a lot? And if so, how do you deal with that?
Absolutely. And there's many versions of this, right? There's a Western lean in, lean out debate. Do you want to lean in or do you want to lean out? And what's right? And women feel like if they make the choice to be a mother, they're being stigmatized, and parenting and child rearing is being undervalued. So that's a Western version of the debate. And I think that there is enormous merit to that debate as well. There's other versions of the debate where you have women who've been raised in certain cultural norms and have come to internalize them and really do feel like they want to spend a lot of their time on how they look and who their husband is, and that's just the path that they want to adopt. There's even feminist debates in across the world that say, well, actually, a woman's place is the home, right? And people will use religious texts to justify that, and these are known as versions of feminism that say a woman is equal but separate, right? That's a very common debate where I come from. It's women are equal, however, their place is in the home. Oh, religion gives a woman so much power. One of the quotes that's very popular is in Islam, the Prophet said that a mother's value is 3 times that of a father. And so, feminists will say, well, look at how much status we give women, that a mother's status is 3 times that of a father. Hence, a woman should really focus on being a mother, because that's where she is given the greatest respect and honor and dignity. There was a great documentary released recently, India's Daughter, that really exposed a lot of the mindsets around women in South Asia. This was based in India, and it covered the rape of Jyoti Singh, the gang rape that made headlines. And it's actually on BBC now because it was banned. It's on YouTube because it was banned in India. It's a great documentary to see, to expose some of the mindsets. And also, I guess the last sort of version of this I'd add is sometimes there are women who are truly feminists, and we don't see it, and are very strong, and we don't see it because they don't fit the stereotype. And so of what we think is a strong woman. So an example is Malala's mother. And everybody would say to me, oh my God, she doesn't seem to be a central figure, and she seems really disempowered because she covers her face. And she did cover her face, and for a long time she refused to come forward on TV because whenever she would show her face, she would get reprimanded by her family back home. But she was central to the family. She was the person who held everyone together, who encouraged Malala and her father to speak out, and her strength was pretty incredible. But for a lot of Western feminists, the fact that she covered her face was too much to take in, to say, well, she can cover her face, but she can still be a feminist. So I think there's many versions of this. And some women have simply internalized the norms. Some women are trying to keep themselves and their daughters safe. If you challenge the norms too much, you can be at risk of violence. There's places even here where women are competitive with each other, where women get used to being the only woman in the room. So when another one walks in, the instinct is to say, well, I don't know if I'm going to support her. And what I've noticed is the more opportunities we create, the more safeguards we create, the more women feel like they can move forward and advance, the more collaborative they become, because it is in our DNA to be collaborative, to prioritize our relationships, to care about the people around us. And it's only in situations where those opportunities are taken away, where we become competitive, where we feel unsafe, that you see the competition become stronger, or the sense of, well, maybe that's not our place becomes stronger. I don't know if that answers the question. It's a fairly long conversation, but
I think it does.
But yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I work with a number of schools, and I do social and emotional learning, and one of the things we talk about is perspective taking. I think your story would be great to share with the girls at this all-girls school I work with. My question is, what would you want from schools here and young girls here to help make an impact in the world, through your organization, or what would you say to those girls, what they could do?
Well, I think it depends on the level of involvement, right? So at the most basic level, anybody can fundraise, anybody can donate, and organizations always need more funding, whether it's the Malala Fund or other organizations doing good work in this space. another one of my favorite organizations that was here was CamFed. I don't know if any of you got to hear from Ann Cotton, but they do great work. So fundraising is always great, you know, understanding the issues, growing up as informed global citizens is very important because that will shape the choices that they make, and they may choose to join the Peace Corps and spend 2 years on the ground, really being hands-on in a local community and coming face to face with the barriers that girls face in education. They may choose to go into developing education technology or starting programs across the world, and those are more high-involved choices, more highly involved choices. I guess the other thing I would say just from a US perspective is over here we're still figuring out how children learn best. And I was someone who never learned very well in a lecture format. I was always bored in school and rebellious and, you know, skipped classes and did the bare minimum to get the good grades. And I always learned better on my own. And I think we're still, you know, we're overdiagnosing things like ADD, and we're telling children they're not smart if they don't ace standardized tests, and we're still coming to understand what intelligence means and how to encourage students to be the best versions of themselves and how to encourage different ways of being intelligent. And I think the more work we do here in the US to crack that code and in Western countries, that has implications globally. Because we can take those techniques and what we learn and apply them globally and transfer that knowledge. So I think that's a very important line of work, and the work that you do with your students to move that forward has global applications.
Thanks. Okay.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
The thing I always get hung up on is the idea of scale. And I work for a global education network dedicated to expanding opportunity around the world called Teach for All. And right now this week, we're having a forum and a Twitter chat around what is the one thing we can do now to impact the quality of girls' education in the future. And when I think, you know, I work at this global network and I think about things on a global scale, and it's like, how do you really, like, how do you achieve that scale that we need to achieve, right?
Yeah, Teach for All is great, and Wendy's been on panel with me, and she's been wonderful. So you guys do great work. What I would say is, you know, scale can become a buzzword very easily for doing absolutely nothing and holding lots of conferences, and I've seen that happen a lot. So I have to say, you know, at the end of the day, if all of us were grassroots entrepreneurs who touched 30 to 50 lives, we would solve the issue of educating, of scale, right? Now, we don't choose to do that, right? Which is a real issue. We don't all choose to, you know, support 50 people if we can to rise out of poverty and get an education, and we probably never will. And I think then it becomes a question of, if you're supporting a program and the program is, you know, a wonderful woman in, you know, Abuja, and she, you know, she brings in underprivileged girls and it costs $3,000 a month, a year per girl because it's housing and healthcare and they're getting the best of the best, that's still a really worthwhile cause, but that's not a solution that you're going to be able to replicate. So she can do great work, she's going to educate these girls, hopefully if something happens to her, she has a plan for who takes over, but it's dependent on this woman, it's dependent on her raising funding, on you always donating, and you're never going to be able to learn from this and replicate it because it's just not scalable to spend that amount of money. And I see a lot of great, big-hearted people doing that sort of work, and you're like, I'm so glad you're changing these 100 lives, but we're not going to be able to replicate this and touch a larger number of lives. And I think over there it's about social businesses, right? And social businesses are different from low-cost businesses. Low-cost businesses target consumers who make more money. Social businesses say, we're going to create a product that the poorest of the poor can access and that they want, and we're going to pull from various sources of revenue to do that. And I think social businesses carry, because they're smart about cost, because they're not going to, you know, for example, I was speaking to bridge schools and I spoke about them earlier, and I said, you know, oh, you're giving your teachers a script. Why don't you just use the videos that exist and like show videos to children rather than giving your teachers a script? And they're like, do you know how much a large screen costs? And I thought that was very smart, right? They're like, we're not going to, you know, pay $100 for a large screen unless it's going to significantly improve outcomes. And so that that hard focus on cost benefit, and then on what people can afford, what people can pay, what are your revenue sources, how are you going to make this sustainable if, you know, USAID cuts your funding tomorrow because suddenly you're not a priority country, what happens then? You know, these are all questions that allow scale to become less of a buzzword and more of a reality.
Okay, we're actually out of time.
Oh, no.
I'm so sorry. Is it a quick question?
I can answer it quickly.
It is.
Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Jacqueline Martinez. I'm a 4th grade bilingual teacher. I had 2 questions, but I'll just ask the first one. Did you have a special teacher growing up that influenced you?
Sort of. You know, I said I was very rebellious, and I was growing up in a place where rebellion was not appreciated. So
understatement.
Yeah. You know, but I had a lot of mentors. You know, I think in terms of teachers, I was very, you know, I would protest a lot, and I was in Islamabad where there was civil society, and I would follow, you know, these activist women around all the time and just, you know, admire them and sit at cafes having coffee feeling like a revolutionary. And so I think they were really my early mentors. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming, and thanks for South by Southwest for inviting both of us.